Welcome to Spacepod, light touch, friendly place for light minds to get together and just talk about what's important to them in the world of workspace. My name's Paul Russell, I work for IBM, and I'm joined by my great colleague, Paul Gatland.
Hello, Paul. Yeah, it's the 1st of September, so it really hasn't time flown by. And what's, I think, surprised us from these guests that we've had is what we've learned and what we hadn't anticipated learning when we started several months ago.
You know what? We took all of the narratives from the 14 episodes before and we built a word cloud. And what really stood out in there was these words, human, well-being, and digital, which really dovetails nicely into who we've got today.
Absolutely. And it's very exciting for us in our last episode to have such an inspirational guest, none other than Harriet Green, businesswoman, digital transformer, wife, mother, daughter, sister, and lifetime learner, who has kindly offered to interview us for a change. So Harriet, welcome to Spacepod.
Thank you so much for inviting me, guys.
And we have to say, this is a personal point of view. It's entirely on that basis, and we don't come on this and make pronouncements or strategy. Nothing's official, and Harriet was happy to go along with that basis. We'll start, I think, with an icebreaker question, Harriet, because Paul and I loved your newsletter, which you've just pushed out this morning. We particularly love the fact that you talked about your 3 hobbies.
Yeah, fabulous. So the newsletter is a collection of the most impactful posts. And, I get many, many thousands of inputs, and the 3 hobbies, I think, is around 40,000 responses already. And I really talked about, for me, 3 things. First of all, the cycling and the yoga, the keeping in shape, and maybe having a goal of circumnavigating the globe next year on the tandem. Being creative, got 3 books on the go. None of them are any good, but I learn a lot from the social media that I do and the interactions from people like yourselves. And then making money, I've been doing a lot of purpose-led stuff, volunteering for the NHS. And now I'm looking at some sort of mission beyond purpose-led transformational work. So watch this space. What are yours, Paul and Paul?
I'm restlessly curious about what I will do next after what I'm doing right now. And I wrote a book several years ago, never been published. My wife encouraged me to do it, and I did. And it sits somewhere in the cloud. And it's still got some legs, I think. It's very much about the role of technology and why people should buy it. So it's quite relevant that I work for a company like IBM. I love running. I'm not really good at it, but I like doing parkrun, done marathons, not very well. I like collecting the medals. And I think, the other thing, I've learned how to cook, and maybe more so in lockdown, because it gives me a chance to prepare for something as opposed to just throwing it together. And that's quite new for me. And again, my wife might jump in and say, yeah, I prefer it when we get a takeaway. That would be my 3.
Fantastic. And Paul, you?
So I guess a bit like you, but not a bit like you, Harry, in that I for keeping in shape, I do like to cycle. It's not a tandem. It's just a single bike.
Yeah.
But I do very much enjoy that. And there's a certain time, I think, when you're on the road, there's nothing else around you. It's a nice warm day, and there's that sizzle of the tires on the road, which is great. So really enjoy doing that. In terms of creativity, I fly a light aircraft, so I think there's always a bit of creativity in terms of getting from A to B and dealing with the unexpected. So that's always been a passion of mine. And in making money, I guess I do like to buy stuff on eBay, and I also like to sell stuff on eBay. And I end up probably costing me money because I always tend to buy more than I sell, but I do enjoy the whole of selling stuff.
Oh, marvelous. Well, I think the whole podcasting, exploring different types of media, I think podcasts, and particularly listening to the ones that you've done, our goal now is to really make this culminating podcast a triumph, in that it is interesting, I hope, create some thought material and actioning solutions for those listening. So if you're okay, the Pauls, I'm going to kick off. I think this theme has come up a great deal through lockdown, and now as we traverse into the new normal. About the future of the workspace. Is there a future of the workspace? How do we balance workspace and workplace as the whole notion of work has been transformed? So I'd love to get your thoughts on that specifically, and then we'll go into kind of digital and productivity. But what is the future of the workspace versus the workplace, gentlemen?
So Harriet, yeah, you question the workspace versus the workplace. And when I hear that question all the time, as you can imagine, I immediately think more than ever before about bricks and mortar, the workplace, not only being the office, but the house and the coffee bar. That bricks and mortar suddenly changes my perspective. And then the workspace, which is that autonomous area that I move around, or we move around. And just going back to the podcast, we had a great interview with Mike Geddy from CBRE, a very, very trusted senior leader. And Mike talked about fluidity in workspace, and the idea that technology will be there as an enabler to allow us to be much more fluid if we're fortunate enough to have that type of job where, you know, it doesn't matter where I am, and the technology can do that, whether it's Microsoft or Google or Zoom or anyone can allow me to do that. But the most important thing, I have context about where I am, because truthfully, no one really cared where people were before, because most people were going to be in an office, and working from home was always seen as a bit of a, a bit of an outlier. And that's changed dramatically. And so suddenly the bricks and mortar changes its importance, but it's not real estate anymore. It's my house or your house. So fundamentally, the future is, yes, they're both incredibly valid. I think the importance are now equal. And we've now got people looking at both of them and saying, my workers will need to be able to go to either or at their choice with some autonomy. And I need to, as an employer, wrap my arms around what that experience is to make sure they get a happier workplace, it's safer, regardless of where they are. And that is a huge shift in thinking for many, many industries, not just the tech and the real estate.
I think it'd be good, Paul, to get your view as well and make sure we're really answering that question around workspace versus workplace. And I think some good kickoff thoughts on that. But what are yours?
Just to really follow on from Paul's comments. I mean, if you take Capita, which was in the news around their plans to close a third of their offices. So I think really, you know, prior to the lockdown, everyone went into the office. And I think organizations have now realized that people can be productive wherever they are. And there may be certain social or family commitments that's actually balanced better from working from a home environment than an office environment. Yeah, to actually reduce a third of their buildings, and people are still obviously being productive. It's just, I think, a step change we would never have experienced and never even predicted earlier on this year. It's going to be a very interesting time going forward as well, and how the workspace and workplace are going to be so different towards as time goes on.
I think this then leads, so the work, if we assume there will be a workspace and a workplace, then keeping this broad but homing into how does then the digital orientation in either the space or the place make us happier and more productive? Because I think getting joy and happiness back into people's lives in the working environment, whilst increasing productivity, is sort of double nirvana. So what do you feel about that, both of you?
So these are great questions, because I think I'll break them down, because I think we have a problem. You know, the more digital we want to become, because actually technologies are letting us do that, the risk is we lose some of the human characteristics like happiness and productivity, which we will fully understand. So it's that blend of the two. The areas that I would really encourage people to do is take an empathetic approach, and we're really successful at being at IBM in terms of, you know, design thinking as a great technique. But being in someone else's shoes, I can't imagine now. I mean, I've even watched the Queen do a Zoom call, and I felt like I was in her shoes, wondering what it's like to be the Queen, suddenly peering down at, you know, a Zoom screen, talking to millions and millions of people. What was she thinking? Did she feel okay? And we found ourselves in the space of other people that we've never ever have thought of before. And we mustn't lose that experience, because inside that experience, from a digital point of view, there's gold dust. Now, AI and all the other technologies are amazing, but they've got to make sure they get that gold dust and use it appropriately. Because if they can do that, we might get happiness. If they don't do that well, we'll get the opposite happiness. And that is a huge concern for mental well-being.
And what about productivity, Paul? If we assume that the happiness that Paul talks to should lead to a greater level of productivity, which certainly, you know, in Europe and UK has been a challenge over the last decade. How do we achieve that second nirvana with happy people of greater productivity? That it doesn't, you know, the balance sheet may look better, you've reduced costs, you're paying out less, but individual productivity, what are your thoughts on increasing that too, sir?
Well, I think, you know, if I travel to the office, you know, really, I guess door to door, it's a couple of hours either side of the day. So really sort of 4 hours a day. That's, I wouldn't say it's wasted, but it's time that I could be more productive rather than traveling. So, you know, I find currently working from home, and this is obviously my personal experience, is that I'm more productive. I can actually work longer hours, but still finished earlier than if I had traveled to the office and back. And with the technology that we use today, with you know, video conferencing and so on, then we can be, I believe, very productive. I think some of the things I miss is, like, you know, these water cooler chats with your colleagues. We do have collaboration tools like Slack that actually work very well. It's not quite the same, but it's probably the closest we're going to get, you know, in that situation. I think one of the things that I do find that's very interesting, though, is between meetings there is that sort of decompression time that you experience when, if you're on one video call after another, it's just straight on. You never seem to have that decompression time, which I think must have an effect on your overall wellness over a period of time.
Just on that point Paul has made, it's really, really interesting, is that we've heard already from some people about the kind of third wheel, which is the corporate HQ and the home, and there's pros and cons for both workplaces, and this kind of hub kind of mentality. So, you know, we had the guy from British Council of Offices, Danny Palmer, on one of the podcasts. Danny talks around business parks. You know, a lot of business parks have kind of lost their way. They've become a bit irrelevant because of where they were. There's no shops near them. And so, you know, there could be an opportunity to create the third workplace, utilizing existing real estate that's local to where we live, to allow us to say, do you know what? I don't need to travel, as Paul said, but I equally don't want to stay at home because there's millions of reasons why it's not sustainable. But actually popping up to the business park and finding a collaborative area that I can work, or in the retail space in a high street in a small town, you know, that could be new opportunities to allow people to go, do you know what? I'm happier and I'm productive, and I didn't need a ton of AI and digitization to make that happen. I just needed some common sense to get it going. And I see that happening already. So that could be a really interesting, pragmatic way forward.
And a double whammy, Paul, because, you know, take that through to the high street and you're solving two problems of improving the profitability and the state of being of high streets as well as kind of workplaces. But do you think that the world is equal here? I mean, it rarely is, but as I do my mutual mentoring with young people, my own family, there seems to be some challenges, particularly in our younger generations who are missing company, interaction, fun, the role that work plays in their social being. And that many of the older stereotypes of wife and mother, that working from home has created not greater productivity, but twice as many hours, twice as much work, and back 20 years in terms of freedom to be the best that you can be in both of those areas. So what about the new demarcation lines? What about some of the challenges that people are facing based on their gender, based on their age, and based on how you communicate in this new world. What are your thoughts on that?
I would start off by saying, I'm a person of a particular privilege, and therefore, there's a bias already as I say that, because I base it on what I experience. So desperately taking myself out of that privileged position, which sounds easy but is incredibly hard to do. But when I think about that and put myself in the shoes of somebody else, you see some things that you shock you in terms of what life must be like. And I've got a real passion, as you know, Harriet, around the digital divide in the UK and globally, about children and people who are in disadvantaged situation and they're losing their digital opportunity. And it's heartbreaking to see what that is. Yet the rest of us, including myself, just assume that it's almost like a compassion fade, that I know it, but I don't really think that's a problem, because I have to educate myself to think about what it must be like. So bias, whether it's the media or technology, is a real risk right now. And I think we've got some big problems to address in terms of, for example, we've seen how we've used data recently, and bias has suddenly popped forward and changed the way we've seen how with exams. We had Mike Bigembe, amazing AI author and real advocate around bias, on podcasting. And he gave us some great examples of some of the challenges when he was just giving the charity with AI, stereotyping people when they were raising money. And the example he gave, that the most successful charities fundraising schemes were when it was a white middle-aged male on a bike, and that's because the algorithm was really using photos to suggest that was. And so Mike was a real challenger to that. So we have a real responsibility, those in privilege, to really understand, and I emphasize really understand, what it must be like. And there are many ways to do that. The risk to us is when we don't, and we make assumptions in the data and how we present it. And there are some challenges for lots of different people. So
yeah, and
probably
I
not a
do
direct
think
answer.
Your work that I've been very interested in, and I hope helpful to you, around the data gaps and some of how we can ensure capabilities that we may waste or may not use all of get given to the right places. So I think your work on that is to be applauded. But demarcation lines, gender and age bias in this new world, Paul, what do you think about that?
If I take a couple of examples, so something a bit closer to home. So my wife was a nail technician, which technically she still is. And over the lockdown period, of course, the whole beauty industry was something that pretty much disappeared. So she came up with this idea about making masks, and that's been actually more successful than doing people's nails. So I guess the whole adapting and really looking at how things change and evolve. Again, I've got two children. One of them is a millennial and one of them is a Generation Z. They've just divided the line. And it is very interesting how they use technology and rely on technology, I think, more than older people. To the point where, I think if they had a choice between do they have running water or data, I think they would actually choose the data. It's just a very interesting approach that they have. I remember the internet, we had problems over the last couple of weeks, and it's almost like their human right has been taken away if they've got no data.
There's a level set chance for us to review what it's like to be, and I've not seen evidence of this yet, when we go back to a new normal or a version 2 of the office or whatever that looks like, to also include in that review, not just, how we space the buildings and, do all the kind of the human aspect, but also look at how we treat people. And, we've seen facial recognition, generally being looked at right now. We've seen challenging around, how we do bias with AI and data and all that machine learning algorithms. So I do hope that employers, and as I'm saying this, I'm thinking, what are IBM doing about this? What are we going to do about making sure we treat people fairly? I think that's got to be a thing that really is uttermost in strategies. I know there's lots of strategies that we'll talk about, but fairness.
Yeah, I think the opportunity to reset, the world has changed. and there are new ways of thinking about things that can address the immediate challenges of, re-entry, as well as old challenges that you refer to. So I'm sort of hearing there is both a workspace and a workplace. I hear both of you believe that a digital orientation and digital solutions can make us happier and more productive. So let's dive a little more deeply then into the role of tech. Listening to some of your prior podcasts, particularly with John and Lisa, you can't really have AI without a digital twin. Yep, it's kind of fine having new buildings. There'll be digital natives. About the way that we improve existing buildings. I'd love to get your view kind of today, not what you might have said a month ago or 2 months ago, but right now, what do you think is the role of tech to help in the new normal of workplace, existing buildings, and creating this happiness and productivity that you've talked to, both of you?
Yeah, thanks, Harriet. One of our guests was a chap from CBRE, Mike Geddy. Mike sent us a document called the Age of Responsive Real Estate, and it was a view of CBRE going out to about 2030. Really sort of just building on Paul's previous comment there about AI and the old being the buildings. In the report, it was really saying that you have baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, effectively all working together, and then you've got AI as another factor. And one of the questions was, are we becoming too digital, potentially less human? But with AI, it's all around collaboration and finding ways to collaborate. So if we can use AI as the final piece to bring everyone together to collaborate more effectively, I think there's some real good that's come out of the situation.
Interesting. Any other thoughts, Paul?
Absolutely. You mentioned Lisa and John, great IBM advocates, and we were so privileged to have them on the previous version of podcast. So I totally agree. The new is the outlier. I came to IBM thinking everyone can build one shiny, brand new, smart building. And we've been found out now because of what's happened. And people are saying, look, it doesn't really matter I've got a shiny HQ. What matters is that I have a workplace, regardless of what it is, what state it's in, that gives happiness, productivity, and all the things we've talked about. So that is going to change our version of the digital twin, because we're no longer designing something that just focuses on collecting data from the fabric, which is very much, the focus on a lot of digital twin in buildings. It has to raise up the agenda and include how do we collect the data from the human being that respects their privacy, make sure there's no bias introduced. And that is right now fundamentally the tech problem, I think, for our industry, because eventually we'll get back to a place where there is a new normal. People are going to say, so what are we doing now then? Are we productive? And I can remember one of the CEOs said, we're still trading as a business when asked the question about return to work. And so you've got this kind of challenge between the business still growing and being successful and what the data can tell you about your workplace coming together. And that's going to be fascinating. So in old buildings specifically, that is going to be where there's got to be a lot more investment as opposed to the new shiny corporate HQs, which I think personally are an outlier right now and possibly irrelevant. And I don't mean that negatively, but actually it's not the place to look at.
Yeah, I agree, Paul. I think that we had great fun in the Munich Industry and IoT Center using data and AI to create the happiness and the collaboration that has been a feature of that environment with employees and with clients. Gathering data around what we breathe in and breathe out to be able to tell the different floors if the cafeteria was full or empty. It's a very engaging way. These things, I think, are 360 holistic responses to applying this technology to make people the goal is happier and more productive. And so you have to think about the solutions in that way, I think. But as we close out, I think it'd be fantastic. I'm going to give some thought to this after you two too. But what are, my thing about what you want your audience to think, feel, and do after this session? So, what 3 things do you want those listening to think, feel, and do about the future of the workspace and the workplace, depending on your view of that? What would you highlight?
Let me start with, what do I want them to think? I really encourage people to really go for thinking differently about their problem statement, whatever that is, whether it's, my management of my real estate, or have I got too much space over here, or how do I just look at your problems and take a step back and actually make sure you're addressing the right problem. We've seen, in the last few months, daily governments fight with, are we dealing with the right problem? Oh, no, we're not. We need to change it. In a totally, unnatural behavior that we have witnessed. And corporates will be no different, I suspect. They'll have to go through that same challenge as well. So really encourage them to learn from what they see, think differently about what their problems are. So that would be the first thing. And then what would they feel? I definitely think feel empathy of your workers. Take time to be the worker in your organization. Do not make assumptions, because as we've learned, especially when we talk around bias, whether it's gender or race or neurodiversity, we have to understand what that must be like. I've seen some examples of people saying, my business tell me I've got to go back to work, but they don't understand my circumstance, and I'm feeling scared, and I'm feeling nervous, and I'm feeling threatened, and it might be even bullying. So, really take some time. And then what are they doing? I suppose pragmatically is bringing together a kind of action team, a think team, a proactive group of people that represent their organization, and actually working as a tight unit. And, if we get an opportunity, we can talk a little bit about what IBM are doing.
Fabulous.
I guess I'll answer it in a slightly different way. So I've got 3 points here that I think we can sort of add think, feel, and do to each one. So from I guess the employer's point of view is, where should their staff work? So where should they work? But then it's, where can they work? So is there somewhere they can work that's better, more productive, more empathetic to their current situation? And then from an employee situation is, where do they want to work? Because if the staff members are at a place that they want to be at, they're going to be more productive than being told to be in a particular situation. So so my 3 really is where should they work, where can they work,
and you think that there's no difference, or you would say that is applicable across, or because of people's age, sex, color, creed, sexuality, physical ability? Is there anything that you would add into that nuanced it for any different group?
I think in terms of where, the type of job that people doing, there's going to be situations where they're going to have to work in a particular location. But from a point of who they are, I think really it's this should be down to the staff member about where they want to be. I think it's got to be all around the person.
No, I would add a couple of things on that. I think this is a perfect time to dust down. I heard Deb Bubb, who's Chief Learning, Development and Leadership Head at IBM, to dust down that scarf model. This is a perfect time. Everyone wants to understand their status, your relative importance to others. Certainty, being able to predict the future. No company better on the planet probably than IBM to help employees with this at the time. Autonomy, does anyone really have a sense of control over future events and how you relate to each other? And then, as already mentioned by you, fairness. So I think that scarf model should be at the center of my next to do, which is use the agile and design thinking to create a methodology for choice. I've had many people talk to me about the abject complexity that it does require a degree in calculus or representation theory to work out what the new return to work approach really is. You know, I go in on the 4th Wednesday and I'm on a rota in a hot desk on the 9th floor. We should, as you have both said, involve those in the workspace and workplace in designing how it should look, because the goal has to be workspace or workplace, happier and more productive people. And the tools and the leadership and the state of being, I think, will help all of that. IBM is clearly one of the greatest companies in the world. And the COVID-19 task force led by John Kelly III, I thought was exceptionally communicative, thoughtful. Typical IBM was embedded not just in the psychology, but the physiology and the anatomy of the organization. The second thing that I've already mentioned is the whole scarf model, using this as a wonderful opportunity to help everyone with their sense of status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And then, you know, the brilliant agile model of solving problems, using data, iterating, coming up with a product really fast. This whole workplace versus workspace challenge is a great place for our own employees, I think, to be very motivated to be a part of that. And I think historically, having created the agile approach to these types of problems in a data-driven world, are great at doing that. But what do you guys think?
In terms of what's IBM doing, I think, you know, I'm very mindful of a huge, huge company, and, you know, we should be able to do these things, but equally there are huge challenges for large organizations. But IBM were on the front foot from the very start. And I can think back to some of the things I've seen about what we started in January in terms of preparation, about, you know, shutting offices down, learning, for example, in the Far East, and moving across the world in terms of making sure our workers were safe. And then kind of once we'd done that and we stabilized what we needed to have open, you know, moving to, you know, managing that situation and monitoring how workers were feeling, and then moving to that execution about getting places open. And what I think is really good is IBM have published a playbook open to anybody who wishes to download this. And it's really about, this is what IBM went through. It's not the right answers. It's, you know, IBM's experiences and what IBM did. But I really liked the way we did that, because that was a culmination of some hackathons and some tech jams that we did, where we explored technology solutions to help. And we've created some of them in terms of Return to Work Advisor is one. And we've used some AI and used some of our existing products as well, like Tririga. But I think it's the openness that IBM is saying to their customers and society as a whole. Use what we've learned in an open, you know, empathetic way, because, you know, we should be able to share what we're learning because of who we are, going back to your point about IBM's heritage. And I think that's where I would encourage people to say, well, actually, even though we are not IBM, we're a mid-market organization, let's say, there are lessons we can still learn from someone the size of IBM that are worth listening to. So I think listening to IBM's openness about this, Harriet, has been refreshing. And as an employee, it's great to work for a company that does that, because it means that other people say to me, I've just seen that and I really like what you did. It doesn't mean that I have to go and tell them, because people are already picking this up, which I think is a great tick in the box for the guys that have created our strategy.
Paul, the final word to you, sir.
Oh, thank you. So again, just picking up on one of the points that Paul mentioned about the Watson Works play that we have, and it's interesting in that we've combined a number of products together to form Watson Works, so we can help companies, you know, with workplace re-entry, the whole facilities management, the safety and wellness, and then the contact tracing as well. So and, you know, talking to organisations, I think they had to look at various locations to try and get all this information together. But again, with IBM, we use it ourselves, and also we've made that a commercial offering as well. So as Paul said, it is great to work at IBM to be able to have that level of resource to put in place when we need to.
Well, I hope people have enjoyed this podcast, found it interesting, and that you'll give us some feedback as interested participants. To the Pauls, a big thank you for your authentic candor, your excellent suggestions, and here's to a really meaningful series that you put together of these podcasts. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Fantastic.